In the freezing darkness before dawn on December 16, 1944, the Ardennes forest shuddered as thousands of German guns opened fire in Hitler's last great gamble of the war. The offensive, Walk am Rhein, was designed to split the Allied armies, seize Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. At the heart of this ambitious plan lay one brutal, all-or-nothing expectation: speed. The German assault depended on armored columns punching through the thin American lines in the Ardennes before U.S. commanders could react, before reserves could mobilize, and before Allied air power could return once the winter fog lifted. And no unit embodied that doctrine of shock and velocity more completely than the elite spearhead Hitler selected to lead the northern thrust, Kampfgruppe Peiper, the armored strike group of the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandard Adolf Hitler. Peiper, only 29 years old, but already one of the Waffen-SS's most aggressive and ruthless commanders, was given the most direct route toward the Meuse. His combat group included Tiger II heavy tanks, Panther tanks, Panzer IVs, armored half-tracks, self-propelled guns, and over 1,000 infantry drawn from the hardened veterans of the Leibstandard Adolf Hitler. His orders were explicit and urgent: break through the American front, cross the Amblève and Somme rivers, seize the road junctions at Stavelot, Trois Ponts, and Werbomont, and be at the Meuse within 48 hours. If he succeeded, the entire northern wing of the German offensive could roll forward unopposed. The German high command believed that Peiper's momentum would be unstoppable. The Americans in the Ardennes were considered inexperienced, spread thin, and resting after months of heavy campaigning. Many U.S. units occupying the line were green, under strength, or equipped with outdated weapons. To the Germans, the Ardennes was the perfect place to strike, a place where their armored spearheads could achieve in days what had taken months during previous offensives. But the Germans overlooked one reality they would soon regret. The Ardennes, though lightly defended, was not undefended. Scattered across its forests and river valleys were small American engineer combat battalions, trained not to hold ground by force, but to shape the battlefield itself, blowing bridges, cratering roads, erecting obstacles, and denying mobility to enemy armor. And leading one of the most experienced of these units was Lieutenant Colonel David E. Pergrin, commander of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion. These men were not frontline infantry. They carried explosives, detonators, mines, and bulldozers instead of heavy weapons. Yet in the coming days, they would prove more critical to the survival of the American front than any rifle regiment in the sector. On the first day of the offensive, Peiper smashed through the U.S. 99th Infantry Division's positions near Losheimer Graben and decimated units of the 14th Cavalry Group. In fast succession, his tanks captured Hansfeld and looted thousands of gallons of American gasoline, desperately needed fuel for the fuel-starved German tanks. By midday on December 17th, Peiper's column had advanced faster than any other German unit, pushing nearly 20 miles into American lines. His Panther tanks rolled through Billingen, firing point-blank into U.S. columns attempting to withdraw. The road to the Amblève seemed wide open. But this was the moment the German plan began to unravel, because while Peiper's tanks stormed ahead, Pergrin's engineers were already moving. At dawn on the 17th, Pergrin received word of the German breakthrough. He immediately understood something few commanders recognized in the chaos of the opening hours. The entire offensive depended on roads and bridges. The Ardennes terrain was a labyrinth of deep river valleys, steep ridges, and icy bottlenecks. Destroy a bridge at the right moment, and an armored column could be delayed not minutes, but hours. And hours were fatal to a blitzkrieg timetable. So Pergrin issued a simple, uncompromising order to his scattered engineer platoons: blow every bridge in the path of the German advance. No delays, no hesitation, no exceptions. On foot, in jeeps, and in trucks loaded with TNT crates, the 291st Engineers fanned out along the Amblève and Somme rivers. They rigged demolition charges beneath wooden spans, set mines along approach roads, and prepared to detonate bridges the instant German armor appeared. Many of the engineers had never fired their rifles in combat, but they knew explosions, terrain, and timing better than any infantry unit in the sector. Pergrin personally reconnoitered the Trois-Ponts area and recognized it as the single most critical choke point in the region. If Peiper could seize the bridges at Trois-Ponts, he could cross the Amblève and race toward his objectives. If he could not, his entire column would be forced into detours that the narrow, winding roads of the Ardennes could not support. As darkness fell on December 17th, both sides unknowingly approached the moment that would decide the fate of Peiper's elite force. Peiper believed he was on the verge of breaking into the American rear, confident that his Tigers and Panthers would blast through any weak resistance. But Pergrin's engineers were waiting in the cold, their charges wired and primed, ready to carry out the most consequential demolitions of the entire Battle of the Bulge. The next 24 hours would prove that sometimes the most decisive blows in war come not from artillery or tanks, but from calculated destruction delivered at exactly the right time. The greatest armored thrust of the Waffen-SS was about to collide with a wall of exploding bridges, and everything would change. When dawn rose on December 18, 1944, the second day of the German offensive, Joachim Peiper believed he was still perfectly positioned to fulfill Hitler's grand vision. His Kampfgruppe had carved a brutal path through American lines, leaving shattered outposts, abandoned trucks, and burning wreckage behind them. The 1st SS Panzer Division spearhead was deep inside the Allied front, farther than any other German unit, and Peiper intended to keep pressing. His Tiger IIs and Panthers revved their cold engines in the frigid Ardennes air, preparing to descend toward the critical river crossings at Stavelot and Trois-Ponts. If those bridges fell into his hands, the road to Verbomont and the Meuse would finally open. Peiper's confidence was understandable. His first 24 hours of combat had been devastating. In Hunsfeld, his men overran elements of the U.S. 3rd Battalion's 394th Infantry, capturing fuel, ammunition, food, and dozens of trucks. At Bühlingen, they seized even more American gasoline, thousands of gallons abandoned in depots and fuel trucks. For a unit that began the offensive with a dangerous fuel deficit, the haul was an unexpected windfall. Panzer crews joked that the Americans were refueling the Reich themselves. Still, even amid early success, troubling signs emerged. Peiper's advance had already slowed from schedule. The roads, frozen and narrow, clogged with wreckage and traffic, forced his columns into long, vulnerable lines. At every crossroads, his tanks encountered unexpected rifle squads, lone anti-tank guns, engineer patrols, and pockets of resistance that were never supposed to exist. Each skirmish cost minutes, then hours. His timetable, 48 hours to the Meuse, was slipping. But Peiper remained certain that once he reached the Amblève River, momentum would return. 3 key bridges, the ones at Stavelot, Trois-Ponts, and the smaller span at Neufmoulins, were essential. German planners expected the Americans to retreat rather than destroy these bridges. They believed the U.S. Army was too stunned, too disorganized, too inexperienced to make a coordinated stand. They were wrong. The first shock, the battle for Stavelot. Peiper reached the outskirts of Stavelot on the morning of December 18, 1944. Expecting a quick breakthrough, he instead ran ahead first into one of the fiercest small-unit defenses of the entire campaign. The Americans had reinforced the town with elements of the 30th Infantry Division, and their resistance forced Peiper into street fighting, not at all the lightning advance he needed. Machine guns raked his infantry. Anti-tank guns fired from windows and alleyways. Engineers detonated roadblocks and demolition charges, collapsing houses into the narrow streets. Peiper's tanks eventually broke through, but precious hours evaporated. It was now late morning, far behind schedule, and he had yet to reach Trois-Ponts, the most important crossing on his route. As Peiper fought through Stavelot, he still believed the U.S. Army lacked the coordination to stop him. What he did not know, what no German commander realized until too late, was that engineers under Lieutenant Colonel Pergrin had been racing ahead of him the entire time, tearing down the very infrastructure his tanks depended on. The race to Troypont and the explosion that changed the battle. Shortly before 11 a.m., Peiper's lead elements, including Panthers and armored half-tracks, rolled westward from Stavolo toward Troypont. His scouts reported an intact bridge over the Amblève at the village. If he could seize it immediately, he could get his armor across before the Americans reacted. But the Americans had already reacted. Peregrine and his 291st Engineer Combat Battalion had been at Troypont since sunrise. They had wired the bridge with TNT, set charges beneath the wooden beams, and stationed riflemen and machine gunners to hold the approaches long enough for the demolition teams to finish their work. The fog-shrouded river valley echoed with the sound of hammering and shouted orders. The engineers knew they were the only thing standing between Peiper and the open road. At 11:15 a.m., as German armored vehicles rounded the final curve and came into view of the bridge, Peregrine gave the order, "Fire it!" The blast shook the entire valley. Timber and steel erupted into the air, sending debris crashing into the river in a boiling cloud of smoke. The bridge, Peiper's critical path forward, vanished in an instant. The SS tanks halted, stunned. Peiper, watching from his command half-track, realized the full significance of what had just happened. His fastest route west was gone. His timetable was broken. His spearhead was trapped on the wrong side of the river. But Peregrine wasn't finished. Engineering chaos. Every bridge destroyed before Peiper arrived. Denied the crossing at Troypont, Peiper turned south toward the smaller bridge at Neufmühlen, only to see another column of white smoke rising as the 291st detonated that bridge too, mere minutes before the SS arrived. Denied again, he pushed toward the bridge at Hennemond, also destroyed. 3 bridges in a row. 3 explosions within hours. 3 choke points that German planners had assumed would be theirs. Peiper's frustration turned to alarm. His column, filled with nearly 150 armored vehicles, had been forced into a narrow, twisting valley with no clear path forward. Every detour cost fuel he did not have. Every delay allowed American infantry and armor to regroup. The realization it was not infantry stopping him, but engineers. As the hours passed, Peiper understood something he had never expected. He was not being stopped by U.S. tanks. He was not being stopped by U.S. artillery. He was being stopped by U.S. engineers, small teams of explosive experts who never intended to fight him head-on, but instead destroyed every path he needed to maintain momentum. It was a tactical nightmare for an armored commander. Blitzkrieg required mobility. Engineers took mobility away. Blitzkrieg required certainty. Engineers replaced certainty with chaos. And as Peiper's forces finally staggered toward La Glaise, running low on fuel, cut off from reinforcements, and unable to cross any major river, he knew his spearhead was no longer a spear, just a heavy, vulnerable column deep in enemy territory. The engineers had won the first phase. Now the trap would close.
By late afternoon on December 18, 1944, the battlefield around the Amblève River had transformed into something Peiper had never faced before. Not a line of infantry, not a fortified town, not even an armored battalion, but a rapidly collapsing network of bridges, blown roads, cratered approaches, and choke points. Every mile he advanced, the destruction grew more deliberate. Every detour forced him deeper into territory his maps had never intended him to traverse. His spearhead, the most heavily armed armored battle group in the Ardennes, was being strangled not by firepower, but by engineering. And the man orchestrating this silent destruction was Lieutenant Colonel David E. Peregrine of the U.S. 291st Engineer Combat Battalion. Peregrine understood something Peiper did not. The Ardennes could be weaponized. In the hours after the German breakthrough, Peregrine identified every bridge, ridge road, and choke point the SS would need. He dispatched platoons with trucks of TNT and Composition C charges to the crossings at Trois Ponts, Neuve-Moulin, Ennemont, Cheneux, and Stavelot. Many engineers worked through the night, laying fuses in freezing water, slipping on ice, using their bare hands to tie charges beneath beams because gloves were too clumsy. They were not trained for frontline combat, yet they carried rifles alongside explosives because they knew Peiper's tanks could arrive at any moment. By the time the first SS vehicles reached Trois Ponts, the 291st had already built a defensive net across the entire valley. Their objective was not to win a firefight, it was to kill momentum. Engineers did not need to stop Peiper forever. They simply needed to stop him long enough for the rest of the U.S. Army to react. The destruction of Neuve-Moulin, a bridge blown with seconds to spare. After Trois Ponts vanished in a roar of smoke and splintered timbers, Peiper swung his column south toward the smaller bridge at Neuve-Moulin. If he could seize it, he could bypass the Amblev block and regain his timetable. He ordered his Panthers to advance at full speed. Snow and frost flew from their tracks as they thundered down the valley road. But Peregrine had predicted this exact maneuver. His engineers at Neuve-Moulin were just finishing their demolition setup when the sound of engines echoed through the forest. One squad delayed firing until the very last second, waiting until SS scouts were nearly in rifle range before they detonated the charges. The explosion tore the span apart in a fountain of mud and shattered timbers. German vehicles screeched to a halt, a Panther nearly sliding into the river. Peiper had now been denied 2 bridges within less than an hour. Hennemont, the third blow that broke the Blitzkrieg plan. Still refusing to abandon the offensive, Peiper drove west in a desperate attempt to find any crossing that remained intact. His column wound through back roads never designed for tanks, jamming into single-lane paths between pine forests. When the SS reached the Hennemont crossing, they found the bridge already destroyed by another engineer detachment. 3 bridges, 3 explosions, 3 critical arteries gone. What German planners had envisioned as a 48-hour armored thrust was disintegrating into a maze of dead ends, burning wreckage, and impassable riverbanks. The SS lose their most important weapon, momentum. Peiper's tanks were deadly at speed. They were nearly helpless when forced to crawl. The Ardennes, with its steep ravines and narrow roads, punished armor that could not move freely. Without an intact bridge, Peiper's route collapsed into 3 options, all disastrous. Drive north and meet fierce resistance in Stavelot, drive south into narrow valleys where his column would stretch miles, or turn west toward L'Église, bottlenecking his entire force into one vulnerable escape route. He chose west and sealed his fate. The 291st ECB sets the final trap. Knowing Peiper was moving toward L'Église, Peregrine ordered his men to destroy every remaining crossing west of the Amblev. Engineer squads worked in blizzard conditions, cutting fuses with knives when fingers went numb, sometimes lighting explosives with burning rags. American infantry was still hours away, artillery was still repositioning, and tank units were spread thin, but the engineers were already in place. When SS scouts reached Cheneux, the bridge was gone. When they probed toward the Somme River, the approaches were cratered and mined. Wherever they turned, the roads ended in smoke and twisted steel. Peiper realized he was not fighting infantry, he was fighting time. Peiper finally understood the truth. He had not encountered a large American defensive line. He had not run into a tank battalion. He had not been bombarded by a major artillery strike. Instead, he was trapped in a collapsing ring of deliberate, methodical destruction. U.S. engineers, soldiers his staff officers dismissed as rear echelon, had done what no Allied tank unit could have achieved in the opening days of the Bulge. They stopped his elite armored column cold. And now, The consequences were beginning to unfold. The slow death of the spearhead. With no bridges left, no fuel depots ahead, and American units converging from every direction, Peiper's Kampfgruppe had began to lose its cohesion. Tanks idled to conserve fuel. Recon vehicles shut down engines entirely. Machine gunners rationed ammunition. SS grenadiers, trained for rapid assaults, were stuck guarding stalled vehicles in the snow. The 291st Engineers had turned Peiper's greatest strength, speed, into a crippling vulnerability. By nightfall, the spearhead of the Waffen-SS, the force Hitler expected to reach the Meuse, was crawling toward Les Glaize, funneled into a cul-de-sac of narrow roads with no river crossings left intact. The trap was almost closed, and Peiper knew it.
By the early hours of December 19, 1944, Peiper's Kampfgruppe, once the razor-sharp spearhead of the entire German offensive, had become a long, frozen column of armor struggling through the darkness. The roads west of Stavelot were choked with stalled Panthers, Tiger IIs, blown half-tracks, fuel trucks stuck on switchbacks, and infantry huddled under blankets in the snow. Every mile they traveled cost fuel they could not replace. Every detour forced them deeper into terrain they had never intended to enter. And every minute lost allowed American units to close in around them. Peiper's elite SS force had not been beaten in open battle. It had been outmaneuvered by explosives and timing, and the consequences were now becoming fatal. The fuel crisis begins. Peiper's force had entered the Ardennes with barely enough fuel to reach the Meuse, and only if everything went perfectly. It had not. The detours forced by the blown bridges at Trois Ponts, Neuf-Moulins, and Hennemont added hours of travel and miles of extra road. The tanks, especially the Tiger IIs, drank fuel at an astonishing rate, sometimes as little as 0.4 miles per gallon in snow and steep terrain. By dawn on the 19th, many Panthers and half-tracks were running on fumes. Peiper needed fuel desperately, and the nearest source lay back in Stavelot, where American forces had regrouped and counterattacked. The battle for Stavelot, the lifeline, severed. Throughout December 19, the SS attempted to reopen their supply corridor through Stavelot, but the Americans, now reinforced by the 30th Infantry Division and elements of the 82nd Airborne, fought block by block to stop them. Engineers of the 291st ECB fought alongside infantry, setting up roadblocks, mines, and anti-tank charges. For the first time in the campaign, Peiper's men realized the full magnitude of their situation. They were deep inside enemy lines, outnumbered, and running out of fuel with no bridgehead and no escape route. Every attempt to retake Stavelot failed. American tank destroyers fired from concealed positions. Rifle squads ambushed SS infantry in the narrow streets. Engineers blew culverts and craters in the roads behind retreating American units. The lifeline was severed. Peiper now had no connection to the German front. Stoumont, the furthest point west. Peiper pushed toward Stoumont, hoping to seize the town, refuel from captured supplies, and potentially break free to the west. On December 19, his advance reached the outskirts of the village, the furthest west any German armor would travel during the entire Battle of the Bulge. But Stoumont became another disaster. The U.S. 30th Infantry Division, supported by engineers and anti-tank units, turned the town into a fortress of snow barricades, machine gun nests, and bazooka teams hiding behind stone walls. Peiper's tanks forced their way through part of the village, but were blasted at close range by bazookas and 90mm guns from American tank destroyers. Without fuel, Peiper could not exploit the penetration. His column stalled. His infantry took heavy casualties. Attempts to break out were beaten back. Les Glaize, the trap closes. By the night of December 19,
Peiper withdrew his battered force to the hilltop village of L'Aglaise, a position he hoped would allow him to hold out until German relief forces arrived. He fortified the town, placing Tiger IIs in commanding positions, preparing for a siege. But the truth was unavoidable. Peiper was trapped. American units had resecured Stavolo to the east, blocking his supply line. To the south, elements of the 82nd Airborne held the dominant ground. To the west, U.S. armor was moving to encircle the area. To the north, roads were impassable or cratered by engineers. L'Aglaise became a cage of steel and snow. American pressure tightens, artillery and roadblocks. Beginning on December 20th, U.S. forces began shelling L'Aglaise. The engineers, including teams from the 291st, continued to block every potential escape route. They felled trees across narrow roads, seeded mines, blew culverts, and turned every bend in the terrain into an obstacle. Even when the SS attempted to move at night, American listening posts heard engines start and directed artillery barrages onto the roads. Panthers were abandoned when fuel tanks dry ran. Half-tracks froze in place. Machine gunners used their last belts of ammunition. German morale began to crack. They had expected a rapid thrust to the Meuse. Instead, they found themselves surrounded by American units who multiplied by the hour. Peiper's last hope, a relief attempt, fails. On December 22nd, German command sent Kampfgruppen Panzer from the north to break through to L'Aglaise, but American resistance at Trois Ponts, anchored by engineers, stopped the relief attempt cold. The same bridges Peiper needed to advance now blocked his rescue. The final order: abandon everything. By December 23rd, Peiper acknowledged the truth: he could not break out. No relief would reach him. Fuel was gone. Ammunition was nearly exhausted. Remaining Tigers and Panthers sat silent, useless. So he issued the order no SS Panzer commander ever wanted to give: destroy the vehicles, prepare to move on foot. That night in sub-zero cold, Peiper led 800 surviving men across the snowy hills and forests, leaving behind more than 135 armored vehicles, including 6 Tiger II heavy tanks, dozens of Panthers, dozens of half-tracks, artillery pieces, trucks, fuel trailers, and support vehicles. It was the largest armor abandonment by the Waffen-SS in the Western Front. The spearhead that was supposed to reach the Meuse disappeared into the night, exhausted, freezing, and defeated. The humiliating realization. After the war, during interrogations and memoir writing, Peiper spoke frankly about the reason for his defeat. His column was not destroyed by American tanks, guns, or air power. It was stopped completely, decisively, by American engineers blowing bridges at exactly the right time and right place. The elite SS Panzer spearhead had been undone by a handful of demolition teams with crates of TNT and a map of the Ardennes.
When Kampfgruppe Peiper abandoned L'Aglaise under cover of darkness on December 23, 1944, the Ardennes forest swallowed what remained of Hitler's most feared armored spearhead. What the SS left behind, smoldering Panthers, frozen Tiger IIs, wrecked half-tracks, burned-out reconnaissance cars, and hundreds of dead, was a monument to a truth the German High Command had never anticipated. The greatest threat to their blitzkrieg was not American armor, nor American infantry, nor American air power. It was American engineers. As the sun rose over L'Aglaise on Christmas Eve, U.S. soldiers and Belgian civilians walked among the hulks Peiper's men had abandoned. The infamous Tiger 213 frozen in place on Rue de l'Église, Panthers lying at awkward angles along narrow roads, and destroyed SS vehicles clustered in the village like an armored graveyard. Many Americans assumed that a major battle had stopped the SS. Few knew the real story,
that a force of fewer than 1,000 combat engineers had shaped the battlefield, controlled the tempo, and sealed the fate of the most elite armored unit in the German army. The power of counter-mobility. In the official after-action reports compiled by the 19th Corps and 1st U.S. Army, the same conclusion appears again and again. The 291st Engineer Combat Battalion's bridge demolitions were decisive. Without Trois Ponts, Peiper's fastest route collapsed. Without Neuf-Moulins, his detour collapsed. Without Ennemont, his final hope of turning south collapsed. Engineers had not simply slowed the SS, they had functionally rewritten the geography of the Ardennes. They turned rivers into walls, valleys into traps, and crossroads into kill zones. They turned time, Blitzkrieg's greatest ally, into Peiper's greatest enemy. These were not soldiers who sought glory or medals. Their work was often cold, wet, and unseen, yet the 291st, 51st, and other engineer units accomplished what no armored division could have done in those crucial first days. They prevented Peiper from moving. A different kind of American heroism. Popular memory of the Battle of the Bulge often focuses on the dramatic stands of Bastogne or the brutal counterattacks along Elsenborn Ridge. But in military historiography, the actions of the engineers have come to be recognized as one of the most strategically important contributions to the entire Ardennes campaign. Lieutenant Colonel David E. Pergrin and the 291st ECB were everywhere, digging in on freezing roads, wiring bridges with TNT while enemy scouts approached, holding crossroads at rifle point to buy a few more minutes, working through snowstorms to prepare detonations, creating minefields and obstacles that forced SS tanks into predictable, vulnerable positions. They stood between Peiper and victory, and they never broke. The strategic impact, how bridge demolitions saved the northern flank. The destruction of the bridges around Trois Ponts did more than trap Peiper. It prevented the northern shoulder of the Bulge from collapsing entirely. If Peiper had crossed the Amblève on December 18th, German tanks would have reached Verbeaumont before the U.S. 82nd Airborne arrived. They could have seized the heights that commanded the Meuse crossings. The offensive might have gained the momentum Hitler needed to fracture the Allied armies. But because the engineers blew those bridges, the 82nd Airborne had time to deploy. The 30th Infantry had time to reposition. Stavelot remained contested, denying SS fuel. Elsenborn Ridge held firm. The Meuse line never came under serious threat. The northern half of the German offensive, Hitler's most ambitious operational plan since 1940, collapsed largely because combat engineers shaped the terrain before Peiper could shape the battle. After the war, Peiper speaks the truth. During his interrogations at Allied POW camps, Peiper was surprisingly candid. He did not blame American armor, he did not blame American artillery, he did not even blame the weather. Instead, he said simply, "The American engineers destroyed my ability to move." That was the end. For a commander trained in the Blitzkrieg doctrine of velocity and shock, immobility was death. The enduring lesson: engineers win wars before the fighting starts. Modern U.S. Army doctrine still cites the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion as a textbook example of how counter-mobility operations can cripple an armored thrust. Their actions illustrate a principle often forgotten outside military circles. The side that controls the terrain controls the battle. Peiper had heavier tanks. He had veteran mechanized infantry. He had surprise, momentum, and a direct order from Hitler to break the American lines at any cost. But Pergrin had explosives, a map, and an understanding of the terrain. And he won. A quiet victory, but a decisive one. When the Battle of the Bulge ended in January 1945, The 291st ECB received official commendations, including from General Eisenhower himself. Yet their legacy is perhaps best summarized by a single truth recognized by historians today. The outcome of the Northern Bulge was decided not by tanks, planes, or infantry, but by American engineers who prevented the enemy from ever reaching the battlefield. The Waffen-SS entered the Ardennes believing they would crush the U.S. Army with speed and steel. They left, realizing they had been defeated by timber, TNT, and the men who knew exactly when to make bridges disappear.